The trauma bay doors slammed open hard enough to rattle the lights. Blood streaked the floor. Monitors screamed. Someone shouted for O negative. At the edge of the room stood a rookie nurse, badge still stiff, hands steady but unnoticed. No one looked at him twice. He was assigned to hold pressure. Nothing more. The patient on the gurney was already slipping. 3 gunshot wounds, 1 dangerously close to the spine. The kind of injuries that make experienced surgeons hesitate. Security flooded the corridor. Federal agents whispered to each other. A name was spoken once, then never again. The rookie nurse adjusted his gloves, leaned closer, and saw something in the wounds that didn't match the chart. His breathing slowed. His eyes changed. What everyone in that room believed about him, about who held authority, who understood violence, who knew what came next, was wrong. And before the night was over, that mistake would cost them time they did not have. The night shift began the way it always did, without ceremony. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The smell of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, sharp enough to sting the back of the throat. Monitors blinked in steady rhythms, the quiet language of bodies being measured and judged by machines. The nurse stood near the medication cart, reviewing charts he already knew by memory. His badge still looked new. The laminate had not yet dulled. The word rookie was never said aloud, but it lived in the way people spoke to him, slowly, carefully, as if sudden movement might break something. Stay with triage tonight, the charge nurse said without looking up. Hold pressure. Fetch supplies. Nothing complicated. He nodded once. No argument. No correction. He had learned long ago that authority was not something you demanded. It was something that arrived when it was needed, or not at all. He moved through the ward with measured steps, never rushed, never idle. When a patient flinched at the needle, he adjusted his angle without comment. When a monitor alarm spiked, he silenced it only after confirming the cause. Small things. Invisible things. The senior nurses barely noticed. That was fine. At 1:47 a.m., the first sound hit before the doors opened. Running feet. Voices overlapping. A gurney slamming into a doorframe hard enough to echo. Trauma incoming. The calm fractured instantly. He was already moving before his name was called. Gloves on. Gown secured. He positioned himself where he was told, left side, chest level. Pressure duty. The doors burst open. The man on the gurney was unconscious, skin already losing color. Blood soaked through the sheets in dark, uneven blooms. 3 wounds were visible. 1 shoulder. 1 lower abdomen. 1 dangerously close to the base of the neck. Gunshot wounds. Not clean. Not distant. Close range. The room filled fast. A trauma surgeon. 2 residents. Respiratory. Security at the door, tense in a way that did not belong to hospitals. Someone said the patient's name. Very quietly. What? Then no one said it again. Pressure here, the surgeon ordered. The nurse placed his hands exactly where they needed to be. Not where he was told, where the bleeding told him to go. The wound near the neck was deceptive. Entry small. Damage not. He felt the subtle vibration beneath his fingers, the kind that didn't show up on scans yet. His breathing slowed automatically. His pulse did not change. He did not speak. Around him, decisions stacked quickly. Blood type confirmed. IVs placed. Orders fired like commands. Security multiplied. 2 men in suits appeared near the back wall, eyes scanning faces instead of charts. Federal posture. Not law enforcement. Something else. The nurse noticed the way one of them never turned his back to the doors. The patient convulsed once, sharp, violent, then went still again. The monitor dipped. Pressure, someone barked louder this time. He increased it by exactly the amount required. No more. Too much pressure here could do more damage than the bullet already had. No one questioned him. No one noticed. A resident hesitated over the neck wound, fingers hovering. Don't probe yet, the nurse said quietly. It was the first thing he had said all night. The resident glanced at him, surprised. Then dismissed him with a shake of the head. Not your call. The nurse stepped back half an inch. Compliance. On the surface. Inside he was already mapping trajectories. Angles. Force. What the shooter had intended, and what they had failed to achieve. This was not random violence. This was incomplete work. The surgeon cursed under his breath as the patient's blood pressure dropped again. We're losing time. The nurse adjusted his stance, anchoring himself, readying for the next instruction he knew was coming. Around him, people moved faster. Voices rose. Tension sharpened. No one looked at him. That was their second mistake. Because as the chaos built, as the room narrowed its focus to survival, the quiet nurse at the patient's side recognized the situation for what it truly was, not just a medical emergency but a contested space. And contested spaces followed rules. Rules he had learned long before he ever wore scrubs. The operating room doors closed with a muted thud, sealing the noise of the corridor behind them. Inside, the air felt heavier. Brighter lights. Sharper focus. The patient was transferred smoothly, practiced hands moving in coordination. The surgeon took position at the head of the table. An anesthesiologist adjusted the ventilator settings. A resident called out vitals in a steady voice that worked hard to sound calm. The nurse remained where he was placed, left side slightly back. Close enough to assist, far enough to be ignored. He watched. Blood loss was significant but inconsistent. The shoulder wound bled aggressively as expected. The abdominal one less so, too little given the trajectory. The neck wound bled in pulses that did not match the monitor's rhythm. That caught his attention. He adjusted suction silently and leaned closer just enough to see. The entry wound was clean, almost careful. The tissue around it showed signs of temporary cavitation, brief, violent displacement, then collapse. High velocity round. Controlled distance. Not a street shooting. The resident prepared to insert a probe again. The nurse spoke quietly, choosing his words with care. That path angles inward. Probing blind could shear something that hasn't failed yet. The room did not stop. But the surgeon glanced at him this time. Just a fraction longer than before. "What's your name?" the surgeon asked. He answered simply. The surgeon nodded once, then turned back to the wound. Noted. The probe went in anyway. The patient's pressure dipped immediately. "Damn it," the anesthesiologist muttered. The nurse stepped forward without asking. He repositioned suction, adjusted compression, and applied pressure at a point slightly above where the surgeon had focused. The bleeding slowed. No announcement. No correction. Just results. The surgeon paused. Looked again. This time more carefully. They stabilized the patient enough to begin controlled exploration. Time was tight but not gone. Yet. Outside the room, raised voices filtered faintly through the walls. Security again. More of them now. The kind that did not wear uniforms and did not ask permission. The nurse caught fragments as the door opened briefly. Not cleared for transfer. Cannot secure the perimeter. If he coded out there. The door shut. Inside, the work continued. As tissue was separated and visibility improved, the inconsistency became undeniable. The abdominal wound had deflected off bone in a way that suggested intent, not accident. The shooter had wanted the patient alive. Or at least not immediately dead. The nurse felt the familiar tightening behind his eyes. Recognition, not emotion. This was an interdiction gone wrong. The surgeon exhaled sharply. Trajectory doesn't make sense. It does, the nurse said softly. If the shooter adjusted mid-shot. Silence followed. The surgeon looked at him fully now. Adjusted how? The nurse hesitated, not from uncertainty but from calculation. How much could he say without stepping outside his role? Angle correction, he replied. Last second. To avoid the spine. The surgeon stared at the wound again, then back at the nurse. You've seen this before. It was not a question. The nurse met his eyes briefly. Neutral. Professional. I've seen enough anatomy to know when something doesn't line up. That was true. It was also incomplete. A monitor alarm chirped. The patient's heart rate spiked, then settled. The anesthesiologist shook his head. He's reacting. He shouldn't be. The nurse adjusted medication levels without being told, careful not to overstep. The reaction subsided. Another result. Another silent correction. The surgeon said nothing, but he stopped dismissing the nurse's presence. Minutes passed. Then more. Outside, something changed. The muffled noise shifted from frantic to controlled urgency. Orders being given. Doors locking. Movement coordinated. Containment. The nurse noticed the way security had repositioned when he glanced through the observation window. Overlapping fields of view. No blind spots. They were not protecting the hospital. They were protecting the patient. The surgeon finally spoke again. We're not just saving his life, are we? No, the nurse said. You're preserving an asset. The word landed heavier than the blood-soaked air. The surgeon did not ask how the nurse knew that. He only nodded once and said, then we don't get a second chance. The nurse adjusted his gloves, eyes returning to the wound near the neck. He knew exactly where the bullet was. He also knew that removing it would change more than the patient's condition. And once it was out, the room would no longer be neutral ground. The first lockdown announcement came without explanation. A calm, practiced voice echoed through the hospital corridors, instructing staff to remain in their assigned areas until further notice. No cause was given. No duration. Just a procedural directive delivered as if it were routine. It was not routine. The nurse noticed the shift before the announcement finished. The way the air changed. The way movement slowed and sharpened at the same time. Outside the operating room, security multiplied again. Not hospital security. These men stood differently. They did not cluster. They covered angles. Two near the elevators. One by the stairwell. One position where he could see reflections in glass. The nurse had seen this configuration before, in places that were never meant to be defended. Inside the room, the surgeon continued working, but his voice had lowered. Fewer words. More listening. Blood loss is stabilizing, the anesthesiologist said. For now. The nurse watched the neck wound closely. The bleeding pattern had changed. Pressure was building. The bullet was lodged near critical structures, close enough that any sudden movement could be catastrophic. The door opened briefly. A man in a dark suit leaned in, eyes sharp, expression controlled. How long? He asked. The surgeon did not look up. I don't give timelines. The man's jaw tightened. You need to. The nurse spoke before the surgeon could respond. Not loudly. Not forcefully. You rush this, he said, and you lose him on the table. The room went still. The man in the suit turned toward him slowly, taking him in for the first time. The badge. The posture. The lack of visible rank. And you are? The man asked. A nurse, he replied. The man studied him for a moment longer than necessary, then looked back at the surgeon. You have 30 minutes. He left. The door sealed again. The surgeon exhaled. That's optimistic. It's enough, the nurse said. The surgeon glanced at him. You sound sure. The nurse did not answer. Minutes passed in tight focus. Instruments exchanged. Incisions widened by millimeters, not centimeters. The nurse adjusted lighting angles, suction placement, retraction. Always just ahead of the surgeon's need, never late. At one point the surgeon paused and looked at him again. Why aren't you shaking? He asked quietly. The nurse's hands were steady. His breathing slow. His eyes clear. Because this part is familiar, he said. The surgeon accepted that without comment. Outside, raised voices cut through the door. Not shouting, but tension sharpened enough to be felt. Someone argued about evacuation routes. Someone else about jurisdiction. The nurse caught a phrase through the wall. Not contained. His attention narrowed. Containment failure meant movement. Movement meant pressure. Pressure meant mistakes. The patient's vitals wavered again. A subtle drop. The nurse adjusted fluid balance, anticipating the dip before the monitor alarmed. Nice catch, the anesthesiologist murmured. The nurse nodded once. Another voice outside. Louder this time. Closer. The door handle rattled. Security responded immediately. Firm. Controlled. The sound of bodies repositioning, blocking. The nurse felt the weight of the moment settle fully now. The hospital was no longer just a place of healing. It was a node in a larger operation that was unraveling. The bullet near the neck was still in place. A problem deferred, not solved. The surgeon wiped his brow. We need to extract before pressure builds any further. Yes, the nurse said. But not yet. The surgeon looked at him sharply. Why not? Because someone is about to make a decision out there, the nurse replied, eyes fixed on the wound, and that decision will affect what happens in this room. Almost on cue, the intercom crackled again. A different voice this time. Lower. More authoritative. All surgical staff, it said. Prepare for immediate transfer contingency. The surgeon swore under his breath. The nurse's jaw tightened slightly. Just once. Transfer now would kill the patient. And whoever was pushing for it either did not understand that, or did not care. The nurse straightened, finally stepping fully into the room's center. Then we don't let them move him, he said calmly. The surgeon stared at him. That's not our call. The nurse met his eyes. It is if you want him alive. The room held its breath. Outside, footsteps approached again, heavier this time, more urgent. The next confrontation would not be medical. And the nurse knew that once it happened, he would no longer be able to stay invisible. The door opened without knocking. Two men entered, both in suits, both carrying the quiet certainty of people used to being obeyed. One wore an earpiece. The other carried a tablet already open, data scrolling. We're moving him, the man with the tablet said. Now. The surgeon did not turn. His hands remained inside the open field, steady, precise. "You move him," he said, "and he arrests before the elevator reaches the ground floor." "That risk has been assessed," the man replied. The nurse watched the exchange closely. He recognized the language. Risk assessed never meant risk accepted. It meant someone far away had decided who was expendable. The patient's vitals dipped again, slight but enough. The nurse stepped forward. Not between the men and the bed. Beside it. "If you transfer him now," he said, calm and measured, "the pressure shift will force the fragment deeper. You'll sever the nerve bundle. Best case, he's paralyzed. Worst case, he bleeds out in under 90 seconds. The man with the earpiece turned sharply. "Who authorized you to speak?" "No one," the nurse replied. "That's why you should listen." Silence fell hard. The surgeon finally looked up, eyes flicking between the nurse and the men. "He's right," she said. "I won't sign off on a transfer." The man with the tablet tightened his grip. "You don't have jurisdiction here." The nurse met his gaze. "Neither do you. Not in this room." That landed. The man with the earpiece studied the nurse carefully now. Not his badge. His stance. The way he held himself without tension. "You've done this before," the man said. "I've kept people alive when decisions were made too fast," the nurse replied. The patient convulsed again, harder this time. The monitor alarm spiked. The surgeon swore. "We're out of time." The nurse moved instantly. No words. He adjusted positioning, applied counterpressure, stabilized the airway with a motion so practiced it looked automatic. The convulsion stopped. The room exhaled. The surgeon looked at the nurse with something close to disbelief. "How did you know?" "Because the fragment shifted," the nurse said. "You felt it? You just didn't realize what it meant yet." The men in suits exchanged a look. 5 minutes, the man with the tablet said finally. "That's all you get." They stepped back but did not leave. The surgeon turned to the nurse. "You take responsibility for this?" The nurse nodded once. "I already have." The surgeon repositioned. "Then guide me." The nurse did not correct her wording. He did not need to. He leaned in, voice low, precise. 2 millimeters to the left. Shallow. Avoid suction until you clear the fascia. The surgeon followed his direction. Blood welled, then slowed. The nurse adjusted the light. "There. You see it?" The surgeon froze. "That's not where the scan showed it." "No," the nurse said. "Because he moved after the scan." The surgeon swallowed. "You're sure?" "Yes." She made the cut. The room held its breath. The fragment came into view, dark, jagged, lodged exactly where the nurse had predicted. The surgeon extracted it with a steady hand. For a moment nothing happened. Then the bleeding stopped. The monitor steadied. The anesthesiologist let out a long breath. "He's stable." No one spoke. The men in suits stared at the tray where the bullet fragment now rested. One of them slowly closed the tablet. The surgeon stepped back from the table, eyes fixed on the nurse. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. The nurse removed his gloves carefully, methodically. Someone who knew this would work. Outside the room, radios crackled. Orders shifted. The tone changed, from urgency to recalibration. The man with the earpiece nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "We'll handle things from here." The nurse did not respond. He stepped back to his original position, hands clasped loosely, posture neutral once more. The authority in the room shifted, but it did not settle on him. Not yet. The operating room did not relax after the extraction. Stability was temporary. Everyone in the room knew it. The surgeon handed off instruments and stepped back, shoulders tight. The anesthesiologist continued monitoring, eyes never leaving the vitals. The bullet fragment was sealed in a clear container and removed from sight almost immediately by one of the men in suits. Evidence moved faster than patients ever did. The nurse watched all of it without comment. He returned to secondary tasks, wiping blood, checking lines, recalibrating monitors, exactly the kind of work expected of someone at his level. No one stopped him. No one questioned him now either. That was the shift. Authority had not been announced. It had simply adjusted its center of gravity. Outside the room, the hospital corridor had transformed. Doors that were usually open were now closed. Staff were being redirected without explanation. Phones were confiscated politely, firmly. People were told to wait in places that had no windows. Containment had become operational reality. The nurse noticed a subtle but critical flaw almost immediately. The men securing the floor were focused outward, on elevators, stairwells, entrances. They were protecting against intrusion. No one was watching the patients past. Every operation had a wake. Loose ends. People who reacted late. The nurse repositioned himself near the observation window under the pretense of restocking supplies. From there, he could see both the corridor and the reflection in the glass behind him. He spotted movement that did not fit. A man in scrubs stood near the far nurse's station, posture wrong. Too still. Eyes not on charts, not on patients, on doors. Not hospital staff. The nurse said nothing. He moved a tray closer to the table, adjusted a line, then leaned toward the surgeon. "There's someone out there who doesn't belong," he said quietly. The surgeon stiffened. "Security's everywhere. Not the kind you're thinking of." She followed his gaze, subtle, through the glass. She saw the man. Hesitated. "He's not on my staff," she said. The nurse nodded. "He won't act yet." "How do you know?" "Because if he were supposed to," the nurse replied, "we'd already be dealing with it." The surgeon swallowed. "Should I call this in?" "Not yet," the nurse said. "You'll spook him." She looked at him again, really looked this time. "You're doing this without clearance." "Yes. And without authority." The nurse adjusted a monitor setting, eyes steady. "Authority doesn't help here." The patient's vitals shifted. Slightly elevated heart rate. Stress response. Subtle. The nurse administered a minor adjustment, easing the response before it escalated. The surgeon watched him do it. "You're managing him like you've done this under fire." The nurse did not answer. Outside, the man in scrubs moved. Slowly. Too deliberately. He drifted toward the supply room nearest the operating suite. The nurse straightened. "If he reaches that door," he said, "he'll either try to get closer to the patient, or he'll disappear." "And if he disappears?" the surgeon asked. "Then we lose him." The surgeon exhaled. "What do you want me to do?" The nurse considered the options quickly. Calling security would cause a visible response. The man would abort, vanish into the hospital's chaos. Letting him act would endanger the patient. There was a third option, but it carried cost. "I'll go," the nurse said. The surgeon's eyes widened. "You can't." "I can," he said. "And I should." She lowered her voice. "If this goes wrong." "It won't," he replied. "But if it does, I'll own it." He removed his gloves, washed his hands slowly, deliberately. No rush. No signal. When he stepped into the corridor, the noise of the hospital rushed back in. Muffled orders, distant alarms, the controlled confusion of a place being quietly seized. He walked toward the supply room at an unremarkable pace. The man in scrubs glanced at him once. Just once. Their eyes met. Recognition flashed, brief, sharp, undeniable. The nurse did not accelerate. Did not confront. He simply adjusted his path, placing himself between the man and the operating suite, as if by coincidence. The man hesitated. That hesitation was enough. Security noticed the disruption in flow. A pause where there should not have been one. Two guards shifted positions, closing a corridor without knowing why. The man in scrubs cursed under his breath and turned away, disappearing into a stairwell meant only for staff. The nurse stopped at the supply room door, pretended to check a list, then turned back. The threat had not been neutralized. But it had been redirected. That was sometimes the best outcome available. He returned to the operating room without incident. The surgeon looked at him as he re-entered. "Did you handle it?" "For now," he said. She studied his face. "This is costing you something." "Yes," he replied. "What?" The nurse glanced once at the patient on the table, alive, stable, unaware. "Visibility," he said. He resumed his place at the side of the room, quiet again. But from that moment on, no decision was made without someone looking to him first, even if they did not admit that was what they were doing. The hospital settled into a strange stillness that felt artificial, like a held breath. Overhead announcements stopped. Elevators no longer chimed. The corridors nearest the operating wing were quiet enough that footsteps carried too far. Every sound felt exposed. Inside the operating room, the patient's vitals remained stable, but only just. Stability was a fragile thing, dependent on constant attention and restraint. The nurse stayed close, adjusting fluids, watching micro-changes that never reached the monitors. He did not relax. Complications never announced themselves loudly. They crept in sideways. The surgeon leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "We should be clear," she said quietly. "Whatever this is, it's bigger than us." "Yes," the nurse replied. "And you're acting like you've accepted that already." He did not look up. Acceptance helps you see options. Before she could respond, the door opened again. This time, the man who entered did not wear a suit. He wore plain clothes, no visible weapon, posture unremarkable. His eyes, however, missed nothing. They moved through the room quickly, patient, staff, equipment, then settled briefly on the nurse. Recognition again. Different from before. More deliberate. "We have a problem," the man said calmly. The shooter didn't act alone. No one spoke. "The individual you intercepted in the corridor," the man continued, "was a late response asset. Not primary. That means someone else is still unaccounted for." The surgeon's face tightened. "Inside the hospital?" "Possibly," the man said. "Or positioned to exploit movement." The nurse finally looked at him. "Movement like a transfer." The man nodded once. "Exactly." The surgeon let out a slow breath. "Then we can't move him." "You can," the man replied. "You just shouldn't." The nurse stepped closer to the table, placing himself between the patient and the doorway without making it obvious. A subtle repositioning. Defensive but not aggressive. "What's the complication?" the nurse asked. The man's eyes flicked to the nurse's hands, then back to his face. "The rounds removed were not meant to kill. They were meant to slow. The real concern is what wasn't fired." The nurse's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Secondary device?" the surgeon asked. "Or secondary team," the man said. "We don't know yet." The patient's heart rate spiked again, sharper this time. Stress response. The nurse adjusted sedation levels, then paused. Something was off. He checked the 4-line manually. Then again. "This line was tampered with," he said quietly. The anesthesiologist stiffened. "That's impossible. It's been under observation." "Not continuously," the nurse replied. "And not by people who know what to look for." The man in plain clothes moved closer. "Explain." The nurse held up the line. "Micro-adjustment. Enough to delay medication onset. Subtle. Intentional." The surgeon swore under her breath. "Someone had access," the anesthesiologist said. "Recently." The nurse's mind moved through the timeline. The corridor incident. The momentary diversion. The supply room. "They weren't trying to kill him here," the nurse said. "They were trying to weaken him for transport." The man in plain clothes nodded slowly. "Which means if we do nothing, they'll force movement another way," the nurse finished. Silence pressed in. The surgeon looked at the nurse. "What do you suggest?" The nurse did not answer immediately. He weighed the cost. The exposure. The line he had been avoiding. "There's a window," he said finally. "Short. We use it to extract completely, no transfer, no delay." The man frowned. "That's not standard protocol." "No," the nurse said. "It's risk mitigation." "And if you're wrong?" the surgeon asked. "Then I'll answer for it," he replied. The man in plain clothes studied him. "You're assuming authority you don't officially have." The nurse met his gaze. "I'm assuming responsibility." The patient's vitals wavered again. A reminder. Time was compressing. The surgeon nodded once. "I'm with him." The man hesitated, then touched his earpiece, listening. His expression changed slightly. "Do it," he said. "But understand this. If this fails, there will be consequences." The nurse already knew that. They moved quickly now, but not frantically. Every action deliberate. The nurse guided positioning, medication timing, pressure management. His directions were minimal, often just a word, sometimes only a hand placed where it needed to be. The complication revealed itself fully halfway through. Internal bleeding, slow and concealed. Not enough to trigger alarms. Enough to kill quietly. The nurse adjusted course instantly, redirecting focus, altering sequence. The surgeon followed without question. Minutes stretched. Then, gradually, the bleeding stopped. The patient stabilized again. Stronger this time. The room exhaled, but no one relaxed. The man in plain clothes spoke softly. "You just closed their last window." The nurse removed his gloves, hands steady but marked with blood. "Then they'll try something else." "Yes," the man agreed. "But now they'll know they've been seen." The surgeon looked at the nurse. "You crossed a line back there." The nurse nodded. "I know. And you did it anyway." "Yes." Outside, the hospital remained locked down, but the tension had changed. Less confusion. More direction. The complication had been contained. The cost had not yet arrived. The cost arrived quietly. Not as confrontation. Not as accusation. As paperwork. A senior administrator entered the operating suite with a tablet and a tight expression, flanked by security who did not need to announce themselves. The crisis had stabilized enough for process to reassert itself, and process was never neutral. "We need statements," the administrator said. Immediately, the surgeon did not look up. "He's still critical." "I'm aware," the administrator replied. "This concerns deviations from protocol." The nurse felt the shift before the words landed. This was the moment authority often revealed itself, not in emergencies but afterward. The man in plain clothes watched from the corner, silent. He did not intervene. The administrator's eyes moved to the nurse. "You authorized multiple adjustments outside your scope." The nurse nodded once. No defense. No explanation. "Yes." The administrator blinked, clearly unprepared for agreement. "You understand that puts the hospital at risk." "It reduced it," the nurse replied calmly. "That's not your determination to make." "No," the nurse said. "It was my responsibility." The surgeon turned sharply. "If there's an issue, it's mine." The nurse raised a hand slightly, not to stop her but to acknowledge her support. "It wasn't," he said. "I guided it." The room went still. The administrator frowned. "Why would you do that?" The nurse considered the question. He could explain. He could contextualize. He could reveal just enough of the truth to shield himself. He chose restraint. "Because the patient needed it," he said. "That's insufficient," the administrator replied. The nurse nodded again. "I understand." The man in plain clothes shifted his weight, watching closely now. This was the moment he had been waiting for, not to protect the nurse but to see what he would do. The administrator continued. "There will be an internal review. Your role in this will be examined." "I'll cooperate," the nurse said. "You may be suspended pending outcome." "Yes." The surgeon stared at him. "You don't have to do this." The nurse met her eyes. "I do." The patient stirred slightly on the table, just enough to remind everyone why they were there. The administrator glanced at the monitors, then back at the nurse. "You're accepting full liability." "Yes." The administrator hesitated, then turned away, satisfied. Process had been fed. When the door closed, the room felt smaller. The surgeon lowered her voice. "You're sacrificing your career." The nurse checked the patient's vitals, adjusting a setting by a fraction. "Careers recover. Lives don't," she finished. He nodded. The man in plain clothes finally stepped forward. "You didn't have to shield us." The nurse looked at him. "You didn't ask me to." "That was intentional," the man said. "I know." Silence settled between them, dense, evaluative. "You could have revealed yourself," the man said. "It would have ended the scrutiny." "Yes," the nurse replied. "And created a different problem." "What problem?" "Attention," the nurse said. "And attention invites pressure." The man studied him carefully. "You're choosing obscurity. I'm choosing control." The patient's vitals stabilized further. Stronger now. The danger receded inch by inch. The surgeon exhaled. "He's going to make it." The nurse felt the tension ease, not relief but completion. The task was nearly finished. Outside the room, radios crackled with new orders. Lockdown easing. Movement resuming. The larger operation adjusting to failure. The man in plain clothes spoke quietly. "There will be a final phase. Someone will try to assign credit, or blame." The nurse removed his gloves one last time. "Let them." "You won't correct the record?" "No." The man nodded slowly. "That restraint is noted." The nurse did not respond. He stepped back into the corner of the room, posture neutral once more. Just another nurse again. Quiet. Replaceable. The patient lived. That was enough. The final procedure began with the room tense but controlled. The bullet near the neck had been stabilized with careful compression, but removal was still critical. One wrong movement, one misjudged angle, and the patient could lose mobility, or worse. The nurse positioned himself exactly where he had anticipated the risks. Not leading. Not commanding. Simply where his skill mattered most. Every motion precise, every glance purposeful. The surgeon followed his silent cues, trusting the subtle shifts in his hands, the adjustments of light and suction, the micro-instructions delivered without words. Outside, the hospital was a cage of containment. Security and federal agents moved silently, a web of observation that the nurse navigated instinctively in his mind even while focused on the patient. Threats were present, but their presence was a background pulse, not panic. As the scalpel cut through tissue, the nurse anticipated resistance points. "Half a centimeter left, shallow," he murmured. The surgeon obeyed instinctively. The bullet came free, jagged but intact. The room exhaled collectively. Monitoring equipment confirmed stabilization. No hemorrhage. No spike in vitals. The patient's blood pressure held steady. The man in plain clothes, who had watched silently all night, stepped forward briefly to collect the fragment. He nodded once at the nurse. A silent acknowledgement, recognition that needed no words. The nurse removed his gloves carefully. Hands were red-stained but steady. He did not look for praise. He did not seek acknowledgement. His work was complete. The surgeon, exhausted, finally spoke. "I don't know how you did it." The nurse shook his head slightly. "It doesn't matter. He's alive." Outside, the building was no longer locked down. Threats had receded, or moved elsewhere. The crisis was over. Yet the night retained its weight, a quiet reminder that lives depended on calm, competence, and restraint. No one called him a hero. No one elevated his role. He returned to the corner of the room, posture neutral, identity unseen, responsibility fully borne. He had led without taking command, saved without declaring victory. And as the patient stabilized, the quiet authority he carried remained unseen, uncelebrated, but undeniable to anyone paying attention. The night continued. The hospital moved into morning shifts. Life resumed its fragile rhythm. The nurse stood at his post, calm, steady, invisible. The battle had ended. His part complete. The morning light seeped through the high windows, softening the harsh lines of the trauma wing. The chaos of the night had receded, leaving the hospital in a fragile calm. Staff moved with rehearsed care. Charts were updated. Machines beeped steadily. Conversations were low, professional, almost hushed. The memory of the night's violence lingered, but no one spoke of it in detail. The nurse walked the familiar corridors, carrying nothing but a clipboard and the weight of decisions that would never be recorded. Colleagues glanced at him occasionally, curiosity flickering in their eyes, but he offered nothing. No smile, no acknowledgement. Just the quiet presence of someone who had been present and competent in ways they could not fully perceive. In a private office, the man in plain clothes stood by the window, watching the activity below. He caught the nurse's reflection in the glass and nodded subtly. The acknowledgement was silent. No words were exchanged. The nurse paused briefly at the patient's room. Through the glass, he saw the Navy SEAL lying in recovery. Monitors confirmed stability. The trauma was contained. The patient was unconscious but safe. A young resident approached the nurse hesitantly. You did everything last night," she said softly. He looked at her calmly. "I did what was necessary. People will notice." He shook his head. "Let them." She hesitated, then nodded, understanding more than she could explain. She turned and walked away. The nurse moved on, back into the hum of routine. Supplies, medications, patient checks, all small, precise, invisible tasks. Each one an anchor to normalcy. Each one a reminder that authority did not always need recognition. In the hallways, the hospital resumed its rhythm. Emergency alarms, monitor beeps, whispered consultations. Life went on. Outside, the city awoke, oblivious to the night that had passed. The nurse finally stopped at a supply closet, leaned against the wall and exhaled slowly. He did not celebrate. He did not dwell. The work had been done. Lives had been preserved. The responsibility had been carried quietly, without spectacle, without expectation. No one would call him a hero. No one would write reports in his favor. But he knew the truth, and that knowledge was enough. He straightened, adjusted his gloves one last time, and walked back into the ward. The world outside remained unaware. The patient lived. The night was survived. And he remained exactly what everyone had believed him to be, a rookie nurse. Yet the weight of unseen authority, calm competence, and moral certainty followed him like a shadow, quietly present but never acknowledged. The hospital moved forward. And he moved with it, steady, invisible, indispensable.